I never thought an app designed to track sleep would make me afraid of the dark. I had been using Sleep as Android for years. It was part of my nightly ritual: set the alarm, place my phone on the bedside table, and let it record my movements and sleep patterns. Most nights the recordings were mundane. A cough, the rustling of sheets, the occasional muttered phrase when I talked in my sleep. Nothing strange, nothing disturbing. Until October 12th. That night, my 3-year-old son slept beside me. He had been afraid of the dark lately, waking up crying about shadows in the room. I assumed it was just his imagination. Children see monsters in every corner, every shadow stretching along the walls. I reassured him, told him it was just the shapes of his toys, the way the curtains moved when the air shifted. I was wrong. The next evening, exhausted from work, I lay in bed scrolling through my sleep recordings as I always did. It had become an almost meditative process, deleting files one by one, listening for anything out of the ordinary. Then I saw it. 2 a.m. I tapped play. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just the familiar hum of white noise from my fan, the soft rustling of my sheets as I turned in my sleep. I almost deleted it without listening all the way through. Then suddenly I heard my own voice. "What are you doing?" I frowned, the sleepiness in my body evaporating instantly. My voice sounded drowsy, detached, the way people speak when they wake up just enough to form words but not enough to remember saying them. Then, a response. Nothing. The voice was low, rough, male, and it wasn't mine. Every hair on my arms stood on end. My breathing slowed. I held my phone tighter, staring at the playback bar as if I could will the voice to be a trick of my imagination. It wasn't. I played it again, this time with the volume turned all the way up. The answer was clear as day. Nothing. It didn't sound like a recording glitch. It didn't sound like an echo of my own voice. It sounded like someone else, someone real, was standing right next to my bed when I asked that question. I didn't remember waking up. I didn't remember asking that question, and I sure as hell didn't remember anyone answering me. For a few seconds, the recording was silent. My own breathing was barely audible. Then, clicks. Soft at first, then louder, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingernails against my phone's microphone, or worse, dragging them across the screen. A shiver ran down my spine. My phone had been on my bedside table the entire night. No one else was in the house, except for my son. I turned my head toward him. He was fast asleep, his small body curled under the covers, breathing steadily. Peaceful. Unaware. I wanted to tell myself that I was just hearing things, that there had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I had woken up briefly and spoken aloud before drifting back into unconsciousness. But then, in the final few seconds of the recording, the voice spoke again. Softer this time. Almost amused. "That's them." Then, silence. The recording ended. I sat there, my fingers white-knuckled around the phone, the dim glow of the screen the only light in the room. A strange, sickening sense of dread spread through my stomach. Who was I speaking to? And more importantly, who was answering me? 2:04 a.m. I checked the time on my phone. 2:04 a.m. The exact moment the recording had been made the night before. I glanced around the room. The shadows seemed darker somehow, stretching farther than they should have in the dim light. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. There had to be an explanation. Maybe my phone had picked up a radio signal. Maybe it was some kind of app glitch. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I reached for my phone's microphone settings, checking to see if any other devices were connected. Nothing. I switched on the flashlight and shined it into the corners of my room, into the hallway, half expecting to see something lurking there. Nothing. And yet, something inside me whispered that I wasn't alone last night. I looked at my son again. his small chest rising and falling in steady breaths. I had told him the shadows in the room weren't real. I had told him there were no monsters here, but as I sat there listening to the silence, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing in around me, I realized I had lied. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't listen again. I told myself that it was just a dream, a fragment of sleep talking mixed with some random interference. That's what I needed to believe. But as soon as I climbed into bed, my mind began spinning in circles. The voice, the clicking sounds, the way the second voice had spoken, calm, deliberate, like it was talking to someone it already knew. That's them. What the hell did that mean? I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house, the creak of the walls settling, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, made my pulse jump. I thought about turning the app off, but a part of me, the part that didn't want to be blind to the truth, left it running. And at 3:15 a.m., I woke up with a start. The room was completely dark, except for the soft, amber glow of the nightlight in the hallway. My son was still asleep beside me, his tiny hand curled around his stuffed toy. But something felt off. I stayed still, listening. Silence. I wasn't sure what had woken me. A sound? A feeling? Then click. I nearly gasped. The noise wasn't loud, but it was close. Too close. I slowly turned my head toward my nightstand where my phone lay face down. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. And then, right before my eyes, my phone's screen flickered on. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The bright bluish light from the screen illuminated the edges of the room. The sound recorder was open. Recording. My stomach clenched into a tight, icy knot. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't set it to record manually. So why was it running? The click came again, this time louder, like fingernails against glass. It was coming from the phone itself. My throat went dry. My hands felt like they were made of stone, but somehow, I forced myself to reach for the phone. My fingers barely brushed the edge of the screen when the recording stopped. A shiver ran down my spine. The app closed by itself. And then, just for a fraction of a second, I saw something. The phone screen flickered, glitching. In that brief, flickering moment, I swore I saw an image in the distortion. A face. No eyes, no mouth. Just an empty, stretched-out void where the features should have been. Then, the phone shut off completely. My breath caught in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the device as I fumbled to turn it back on. The screen lit up normally now as if nothing had happened. The recorder was off. The app had closed. No new files saved. No proof. Nothing. I stared at the blank screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had been awake this time. I had seen it happen. And yet, it left no trace. That was when I realized something. It wasn't just watching me. It didn't want me to know. The drawing. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, a power surge, a random app malfunction. But deep down, I knew the truth. At breakfast, my son was quiet. Normally, he chattered nonstop about cartoons or dinosaurs. But today he was drawing. Thick, dark lines scrawled across the paper. At first, I thought he was just scribbling. But then, I looked closer. It was a person, a tall, thin figure with no face. My blood ran cold. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice as light as possible. "Who's that, baby?" I asked. He kept drawing. The man in the corner. I felt the air leave my lungs. My hands tightened around my coffee mug. "What man?" "The one that clicks," he said simply. "He was watching us last night." I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. He didn't look scared. That was the worst part. He just knew. Like it was normal. Like the thing had always been there. Watching, waiting, clicking. And then my son looked up at me, his small voice calm. "He says he wants to talk to you again." I didn't touch the drawing. I didn't ask my son any more questions. I just stared at the crude, jagged lines of the faceless figure, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in on me. The one that clicks. That's what he had said, and he had been watching us. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "That's an interesting drawing, sweetheart," I said. My son just nodded, as if there was nothing strange about it at all. Then he picked up his crayon and added something else. A phone. He drew a tiny rectangle in front of the faceless figure, with small scribbled lines inside of it. Sound waves. A recording. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Is that my phone?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded. "Yeah." He talks through it. I felt ice crawl up my spine. Before I could say anything else, my son giggled. "He says he likes your voice." The static returns. That night I didn't want to sleep. But exhaustion is cruel, and no matter how much fear churned in my gut, my body had other plans. At some point in the early hours, I drifted off. And then I dreamed. No, not a dream. It felt real. I was in my bed, lying on my side, facing the wall. The room was silent. But I felt something. A presence. I couldn't move. Couldn't turn my head. My limbs felt weighted, paralyzed. The air around me was thick, pressing against my skin like a heavy blanket. Then, the clicks. Loud. Sharp. Right next to my ear. I wanted to scream, to thrash, but my body wouldn't respond. Then came the breathing. Deep. Slow. Not mine. The mattress shifted slightly, as if someone was standing just beside the bed, leaning down. The presence pressed closer. My phone was on the bedside table behind me. The screen lit up. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, the glow against my back. A voice whispered, so close to my ear that I could feel the breath of it. "Can you hear me now?" My body jolted awake. I gasped, sucking in a sharp breath, my chest rising and falling in frantic movements. The room was silent. I turned my head toward the nightstand. My phone's screen was on. The recording app was open, and at the top of the screen, a new file. The recording. I couldn't bring myself to play it right away. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The timestamp read, 3:27 a.m. I hadn't touched my phone. I hadn't set it to record. But there it was. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to press play. The first few seconds were silent. Then, static. Soft at first. Then louder, like an old radio tuning into a dead channel. The sound warped, bending and twisting. A whisper, too faint to understand. Then, something closer. A breath. My breath. And then, "Can you hear me now?" It was clear. Too clear. The same words I had heard in the dream, if it was a dream at all. Then, clicks. Not distant anymore, right next to the microphone. The breath returned, deeper now. And then, something else. A laugh. A distorted, garbled chuckle that made my stomach churn. I slammed my finger against the screen, stopping the playback. My hands were trembling, the phone slick with sweat. I turned toward my son. He was sitting up in bed, wide awake, and smiling. I felt something inside me break. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Then, in the softest whisper, my son said, "He says you can hear him now." I couldn't move. My son sat there in the dim light, his tiny frame still, his face lit only by the eerie glow of my phone. "He says you can hear him now." His voice was light. Too light. Like this was normal. Like it was just another bedtime conversation. But nothing about this was normal. I felt like I had been plunged into ice water, my skin crawling with something unseen, something watching. The shadows in the room seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally long across the walls. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "who are you talking about?" He blinked, tilting his head slightly, like he was listening. Then he whispered, "The man in the static." A chill ran down my spine. The static? My voice barely made it past my throat. My son nodded, then looked toward the dark corner of the room. The same corner he had been afraid of before. But he wasn't afraid now. He was smiling. I forced myself to follow his gaze. My eyes strained against the darkness, my mind screaming at me to stop looking. But I had to. Nothing was there, just shadows. But the longer I stared, the more I felt it. The pressure in the air. The weight of something unseen standing just out of reach. Then, the whispering started. The whispering room. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, distant murmur. Too low to understand, too quiet to pinpoint. Then it grew louder. Not just one voice. Multiple. Whispers bleeding together, overlapping, their words impossible to make out. I whipped my head toward my son. His smile had faded. Now, he looked almost worried. "Mommy," he whispered. "He says you shouldn't listen." I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. But I couldn't block it out. The voices grew, surrounding me, filling the space between the walls, behind my ears, beneath my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over them as my heart pounded in my chest. The room hummed with something unnatural, something wrong. The whispers twisted together, morphing, crackling like static interference. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The room went silent. Too silent, like the world itself was holding its breath. I lowered my hands. My son was still staring at the corner. I knew, if I looked, I would see something. But before I could move, my phone screen flickered. I barely had time to register what was happening before the screen glitched, distorting, twisting the light into something unnatural. And then, a voice, deep and inhuman, erupted from the speaker. "Can you see me now?" The man in the static. I grabbed my son, pulling him toward me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The phone shut off. The room was dark again. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat, hammering like a drum inside my skull. Then, my son whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's still here." I didn't sleep after that. I sat there clutching my son, my eyes locked on the corner of the room, waiting, listening, and knowing, deep in my bones, that something was listening back. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my sister, not my friends, not even my son. Because how could I? How do you explain that something unseen left bruises on your wrist? That something invisible crawled onto your bed in the middle of the night? That your child, your own flesh and blood, knew it was there before you did? No one would believe me. Hell, I didn't even want to believe me. But the proof was on my phone. That video. The way the blankets had shifted on their own. The impressions of something unseen pressing into the mattress. I should have deleted it. I should have thrown my phone across the room, smashed it, set it on fire. Anything but what I actually did. I watched it. Over and over and over again, searching for something. Anything. A mistake. A glitch. A rational explanation. But there wasn't one. And then the next night the door opened. 3:33 a.m. A noise woke me. Not a whisper, not a click. Something else. Something slow. Something deliberate. I turned my head toward the hallway. The bedroom door, which I had locked before going to sleep, was open. Just slightly. A sliver of darkness beyond the frame. I blinked rapidly, trying to convince myself that I had just forgotten to lock it, that the old hinges had just loosened on their own. Then, creak. The door moved, just an inch. The darkness beyond it seemed thicker now, as if it had depth, as if it was breathing. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then, something stepped forward, not into the room, not entirely, but enough. enough for me to see fingers curling around the edge of the door. Long, thin, the skin stretched too tight over the knuckles. Not human. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shallow, my heart slamming against my ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't wake my son. I wouldn't wake my son. I forced myself to stay still. I waited. Seconds passed, then the fingers slid back. The door creaked again. Then silence. I didn't open my eyes. I stayed awake, paralyzed, until the first hints of morning light crept through the curtains. Then, when I was sure it was safe, I turned toward my son. He was already awake. His big, sleepy eyes met mine, and he whispered, "I told you not to look." I thought the worst had passed, that the bruises on my wrist, the whispering in the dark, and the unseen fingers curling around my door had been the peak of the nightmare. I was wrong. The worst part wasn't what I had seen. It was what I was about to hear. The new recording. The following night, I hesitated before setting up my phone again. I had proof now. Bruises on my skin, movement in the video, the door opening on its own. But none of it told me what I wanted to know. What was it? What did it want? And why? Why did it keep speaking to me? I had to find out. So, I placed my phone on the nightstand, set the camera to record, and tried to sleep. I didn't expect to. But somehow, exhaustion pulled me under. And when I woke up, I felt it again. Something had been in the room. I turned over, hands trembling as I reached for my phone. The screen flickered to life. A new file, 3:47 a.m. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pressed play. At first there was only silence, then the whispering. But this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't floating through the walls or bleeding through static. It was close, right beside the microphone, and it was speaking to me. I turned up the volume, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was deep, slow, careful. It spoke in fragments, words tangled with the sound of quiet clicks. "Do you remember?" The voice crackled, cutting in and out. "Do you remember me?" I gripped the phone tighter. The voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same one that had whispered to me before, the same one that had laughed, the same one my son spoke to in the dark. The voice was waiting. I forced myself to keep listening. There was a pause, then, softer this time, "Look behind the wall." And then, the worst part, something moved. Not in the room, not in the hallway, inside the walls. A slow, deliberate shuffling. The sound of something dragging itself through the hollow space between the drywall. I dropped the phone. The sound was still playing, filling the room, filling my head. I turned to my son who lay beside me. He wasn't sleeping. He was awake, and he was listening. His little hands clutched the blankets, his body tense. But he didn't look at me. He looked at the wall, as if he knew exactly where the sound was coming from, as if he knew exactly what was inside. I reached out to touch him, to comfort him, to comfort myself. But before I could say a word, he whispered, "Mommy, he's coming out." I wanted to believe my son was imagining things, that the whispers, the voice, the thing inside the walls, none of it was real. But then I heard it myself. I heard it moving, dragging itself through the hollow space behind the drywall. And when I woke up the next morning, the cracks were there. The cracks. The first one was barely noticeable, a thin, jagged line running along the wall just behind the bed frame. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the uneven break in the paint. Had it always been there? I told myself it must have been. Just an old imperfection I had never noticed before. But when I stepped back, I saw another, and another. Thin fractures in the wall, branching out like veins, as if something had been pushing against it from the other side. My stomach turned. I pressed my palm against the largest crack, half expecting to feel something press back. Nothing. But the wall felt hollow. as if the space inside wasn't empty at all, as if something was waiting. I swallowed hard and turned to my son. He was sitting on the bed, legs crossed, watching me carefully. I forced a smile. "It's just an old house, baby. Sometimes walls crack over time." He didn't respond. He just tilted his head, his little brow furrowing. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "But it wasn't cracked yesterday." I felt my blood run cold. Because he was right. It wasn't. And the cracks weren't old. They were spreading. Something is changing. By the next night, the cracks had grown. Not by much, but enough that I noticed. The lines stretched farther now, branching up toward the ceiling. The drywall flaked at the edges like something underneath it was shifting. Something trying to push through. I thought about leaving. Packing a bag, grabbing my son, and just running. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just the house, it wasn't something I could escape, it wasn't outside, it was inside. And it was getting closer. 3:42 a.m. I woke up to a sound. A deep, hollow creak. Like wood bending under pressure. Like something was pressing against the walls. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the cracks. And then, I saw it. Just for a second. The wall moved. Not much. But enough. The faintest bulge. As if something on the other side had pressed against it just barely. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my son's arm, pulling him closer. He was awake. He had been watching. I felt his little fingers tighten around mine. Then he whispered, "It's almost here. I should have left. I should have packed a bag, grabbed my son, and walked out of that house without looking back." But I didn't. I told myself the cracks were just old foundation damage. That the whispering was just my imagination. That my son, my innocent little boy, wasn't actually talking to something that shouldn't exist. I lied to myself. And that night, the wall opened. 3:59 a.m. I woke up with a start. I didn't know why at first. The room was silent. No whispers, no clicks, no dragging inside the walls. Just silence. But something was off. The air felt heavy, thick, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, replaced with something denser. I turned my head toward the cracks, and my stomach dropped. The wall was open, not broken, not shattered, open. The cracks had spread, splitting the drywall into jagged, uneven pieces, and in the center, a thin, vertical gap, a space just wide enough to see through, just wide enough for something to look back. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My son moved beside me. I snapped my head toward him, ready to grab him, to run. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wall, at the gap. And then, he smiled. A small, quiet smile, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he knew what was coming next. Then slowly, something reached through. A hand, long, thin. Fingers that shouldn't be that long, stretching too far, curling against the edge of the wall. Then, another. Both hands pressed against the opening, pulling it wider. The sound of tearing drywall filled the room. And then, a head. Or something that should have been a head. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. It was just a shape. A void. A mass of nothingness where a face should have been. And it was looking at me. My throat closed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Then my son whispered, "He's here." And the lights went out. The lights were gone. The room was pitch black, so dark I couldn't see my own hands. But I knew it was still there. I could hear it. The quiet clicks. The slow, measured breathing. Something stepped out from the wall. I felt the weight of it. Not just in the room. Inside me. Like the air itself had changed. Thicker, heavier. Pressing into my skin like invisible hands. I wanted to move. To grab my son. To run. But I couldn't. Because he was still sitting perfectly still. Still staring. Still smiling. "Mommy," he whispered. "Don't be scared." Something shifted in the dark. Then, A voice. Not a whisper this time. Not a distorted, crackling sound through my phone. It was right in front of me. I see you now. The shape in the dark. I clutched my son, pressing him close to me, my body shaking. Then the bed dipped. Like something, had climbed onto it. The mattress creaked under the weight. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted it to be a nightmare, but I could feel it. The shift in the air, the unnatural cold against my skin, and then a hand touched my face. Not warm, not human. Cold. Empty. A touch that didn't feel like it was from this world. You remember me now? I choked back a sob. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to remember. Then, my son laughed. Software quiet. Like he was laughing at a secret I didn't understand. He's been waiting for you, Mommy. The thing pressed closer. I could feel the void where its face should be. And then, in the darkness, I saw it. 2 holes where eyes should have been. Not empty, but endless. A bottomless black that pulled me in. The room collapsed around me, and then everything went white. White. I was floating in white. Not light, not warmth, just nothing. For the first time, I couldn't hear him. No whispers, no clicks, no breathing, just silence. And then a voice, but not his. Mommy, wake up. The real world. I gasped, my body jerking awake. I was still in my bed, still holding my son. But something was wrong. The room felt off, not empty, but different. I turned to my son, my heart hammering against my ribs. He blinked up at me, confused. Mommy? His voice was small, uncertain, like he didn't remember, like none of it had happened. I looked toward the wall. No cracks, no broken drywall, no sign that anything had ever been there. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Had I imagined everything? Number because my phone was still in my hand, and the screen was still recording. The last file. My fingers trembled as I stopped the recording. There was a new file, timestamp, 3:59 a.m. I hesitated. Then slowly I pressed play. At first silence, then clicks. Not slow this time, faster, erratic, like something panicking. A rush of static followed, then a voice, but not his, not the whisper I had been hearing in the dark for weeks. This voice was desperate. Help me. The blood in my veins turned to ice. A deep breath, shaky, uneven. Then it took my place. The recording ended. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Took my place? What did that mean? I turned to my son. His big, sleepy eyes met mine. He looked the same, sounded the same, but something inside me screamed that it wasn't him. Mommy? I didn't answer. I just stared, because deep in my chest, in the place that knew things before my mind could accept them, I knew. Something had changed. Something was wrong. And the real horror? I had no idea what.